Just a heads up before we get into today's video. Go and support the author and check out his YouTube channel, Black Volumes. It'll be linked below in the description. Marty Baker hasn't had a single good idea in his entire 24 years of life. That makes me sound like a bit of a crummy friend now, doesn't it? But just stick around for a second, because the story that I'm about to tell you from a mere couple of weekends ago is one that, rightly or wrongly, I keep finding myself blaming on Marty. And I guess that does in a way make me a tool, because it wasn't Marty's fault. It's never Marty's fault. Yet disastrous consequences always seem to follow his decisions. And believe me when I promise that I wouldn't say such a thing if he were simply, just a little oafish. If he were simply prone to making quirky mistakes. We all have clumsy friends or ones who don't properly think through events. However, that just isn't the case with Marty. Never has been. He's an incredibly intelligent man. An incredibly thoughtful man. He just, to put it quite simply, has a proclivity for catastrophes. He manages to say, do, and think things that always, without fail, result in ruin for all involved. And that has always made his friends and family chuckle, but it's always horrified me. Even before we saw, a fortnight ago, the first truly bad consequence of his plans. To give you some insight, I've been friends with Marty Baker since we were 4 years old, in our first year of school. So I say all of this with absolute conviction. I became close friends with him shortly after his father died in Gisburn Forest, a freak accident involving some sort of high school reunion. I felt sorry for the boy, and he was a kind kid. Anyhow, the disaster started off as small and inconsequential things, dropping and breaking his calculator, accidentally giving me a black eye while playing football, which earned the two of us detention in spite of our protests that we weren't fighting. As I said, small and inconsequential things that taken individually meant nothing. Everybody has stories like that from their childhoods. But most folk don't have as many as Marty Baker does today, at the age of 24. The first frightening consequence of his actions came on bonfire night in 2007, when he burnt down Mrs. Oak's classroom. Didn't nearly burn it down, no, he fully succeeded in torching the small detached building to the ground. In burning it to a crisp, was it an act of malice? Of course not. Marty doesn't have a malicious bone in his body. The fire was lit when he tripped over a conveniently placed pebble, and his sparkler flew from his hand, and it caught a decorative banner hanging out of Mrs. Oak's open window. Yeah, she caught some flack for that. But the truth of the matter is that she wasn't to blame and Marty wasn't to blame. His life was, as if penned by Lemony Snicket, a series of unfortunate events. And again, most people seem to think little of it. Even after the fire, thankfully nobody was hurt, so everybody forgot and life continued. Marty was still viewed as the funny, accident-prone boy. But as much as I loved him dearly, every accident of his, whether it involved others or just himself, it always filled me with a deep and inexplicable sense of dread. I didn't know why, but I didn't trust it. I didn't feel safe with any of it. And why did I start with a story from 18 years ago? Well, during our 2 decades of friendship, there have been numerous instances just like that bonfire night. Marty doesn't purposefully invite darkness. Darkness invites him. That's how I've always viewed it, as insane as it has always sounded to me. I've often tried to explain this fear in my gut with a magical thought, that perhaps his accidents might be part of some disturbing punishment from the very universe itself. And I finally had my answer after our recent ill-fated trip to Gisburn Forest. Gisburn Forest, the forest in which Marty's father lost his life back in 2005, during a high school reunion with his fellow classmates, class of '92. Rumors from folk in my area suggest that other attendees at that 2005 barbecue in the woods, near a reservoir that they frequented as teenagers, had little to say about Mr. Baker's death. Marty's father allegedly drank too much and drowned in Stock's reservoir. So we were all a little alarmed when Marty told us during a 2025 New Year's Eve party that he wanted to go camping in Gisburn of all places. None of us said anything. I could tell by the looks in the eyes of Angela and Gracie, our two close friends, that they were just as concerned by Marty's suggestion as me. But I chalked it up to a need for closure. It had very nearly been 20 years since the horrific death of Marty's father, and who were we to deny him that? As his friends, we all agreed. Of course we did. I didn't share any words with Angela and Gracie about why Marty had suggested it. I don't think any of us wanted to touch upon such a sensitive subject. Heck, maybe they'd even forgotten that the reservoir in which Mr. Baker died was right next door to Gisburn Forest, but I doubt it. In any case, I'm sure most people would be put off from attending such a camping trip. The thought that Marty might drag us to Stock's reservoir had certainly crossed my mind, and that would have been a macabre way to spend the weekend. I didn't much fancy the idea of sleeping next to the body of water in which his father had drowned. Of course, as always, that gnawing sensation in my gut had returned, so in truth, I wasn't really that frightened of sleeping next to a lake. And as it would happen, that wasn't the camping spot that Marty had chosen anyway. No, I was worried about the thing that always worried me when it came to what I like to call matters of Marty, the inevitability of disaster. As the years had gone by and we had grown older, that heavy shadow cast over Marty's life had only seemed to grow darker, an omen that seemed to be burning darkly and more viciously than ever on this particularly brutal trip to Gisburn Forest. I found comfort for most of the drive in the stone walls and lush fields rolling past the windows. They took my mind off of dusk's speedy approach. And with the blackness of night, I knew would come the trees of Gisburn Forest, the true horror on the horizon. And when we pulled into a car park, an empty one at that beside the road, it took a lot of encouragement from Angela, Gracie, and me to join Marty outside the car. He eagerly pulled his hiking boots onto his feet, seemingly oblivious to the powerful gusts nearly sweeping him away, but certainly not oblivious to the rain soaking his clothes, as he was already shivering. He simply wore a brave face. "Come on," I said to Angela and Gracie as I opened my door. The sooner that we ripped the plaster off, the better. Though daylight persisted behind the gray clouds above, night might as well have been there already. All light had left the world, and I scolded myself for being dramatic, for letting my anxious disposition get the better of me, as it tends to do. However, I knew deep down in my gut that I was justified in feeling this way, that we should get back in the car and leave, that we shouldn't follow Marty into the field ahead. The field that led towards not trees, but the watery pit in which his father had so horribly perished. Whose bright idea was it to book this Friday off work, and not even do something fun like hitting a bar, but to go camping in the middle of a storm? I asked, shivering as we trudged away from the car park. I knew exactly whose idea it had been, of course. I was simply trying to lift the mood, as I knew we were all a little on edge for various reasons. Well, for the same reason. There was an elephant in the room. The storm. I don't know, but I knew that Angela and Gracie weren't going to mention Marty's father unless Marty himself had opened the conversation. So that was why I attempted, as always, to lighten the mood. I was setting somebody, anybody really, I didn't mind, up to nail some sort of punchline. And before Marty had a chance to save himself, Gracie had stepped into the role. We all know that something's bound to go wrong when Marty plans a weekend trip. She shouted over the wailing breeze, tightening her coat hood around her shuddering face. Marty huffed loudly. "Oh, give me a break. I booked this 2 weeks ago. How was I supposed to know that there would be a severe weather warning? It's not my fault." "I know it's never your fault, Marty," I replied, much as I always replied, before chuckling. And I say that with absolute sincerity. It is undoubtedly never your fault. But somehow in some way, something always goes wrong whenever it's your turn to plan a weekend trip. You have to admit that. If you bring up Edinburgh again, he started. The Airbnb only had 2 beds, Marty. Angela practically screamed over the roaring wind as our boots slipped deeper into the wet grass. I found it more preferable to look at the sludgy muck below our feet than the dark, foreboding tree line which loomed 100 yards ahead of us. The listing said, accommodates 4 people, our defensive friend yelled back. Yes, 4 people, Marty. The implication was that it would be 2 couples. Didn't you see the honeymoon window between the in-suite and our bed? I asked, laughing intermittently. Believe it or not, I wasn't watching you drop a load, Andrew, Marty shouted back. Oh, honey, let's not fight, I teased, already feeling much lighter, feeling as always as if I had let my nervous problems get the better of my rational mind. We had a cozy night now, didn't we? Spooning in bed. He turned to look at me and grinned. Sure, buddy. You definitely called me Gracie at one point, though. Angela howled with laughter while Gracie and I both blushed. The swift and savage retort from Marty certainly brought a swift end to our merciless ribbing. And in an effort to move the subject along, I lifted my head a little higher to get a better look at the scenery ahead of us. Looks impressive, I said. I saw Marty's head bob up and down in agreement. Yep, I've always wanted to come here, you know. And that was it. All he said on the matter. Angela, Gracie, and I exchanged some sorrowful looks. That was all the confirmation that we had ever needed, in fairness. This was, as I had expected, all about closure for Marty. Yet something still didn't sit well with me. Laughing and joking with my friends had only ever taken me so far in shaking off that scratching sensation on the back of my neck. The sensation that something was very wrong with Marty, and it was a wrongness that came about through no fault of his own, as we always say. No ill intent lies in my best friend's heart, I know that. Something wicked has been clinging to his skin for 20 years, and I pray that we have finally rooted it out. At a great cost. Between our exposed part of the field and the woodland beyond, conifer trees formed a broad line, a defensive shield perhaps, but protecting us from the forest. How I wish that I could go back to that moment and yell at the 4 of us to turn around. How I wish that in some parallel universe, perhaps, the belligerent wind may have beaten us back to the car. But in this life, in this world, none of that happened. We ignored the feelings in our guts. I sensed, as I've always sensed, that I wasn't alone in my feelings of apprehension. I'm not some special man, not gifted with the powers of perception. I think everyone feels it. Those who come too close to Marty, they feel that there is something not quite right with him, as kind and wonderful a man as he may be. The truth of the matter is that no matter how much I harp about his wonderful nature and it not being his fault, it doesn't matter now, does it? When we sense something evil, we run from it. That's human nature. That's why Marty Baker has struggled to maintain long-term friendships throughout most of his life. It has taken all of my willpower and strength to stay by his side for 20 years. And I felt at first quite relieved to be sheltered by the canopy of leaves 20 feet above our heads. The storm still raged, of course, but the swaying trees weathered the brunt of the gusty attack, and sunlight still poured through the gaps between the leaves. The tempest certainty added a little excitement to our woodland walk, so I tried as woefully as humanly possible to see the good in the experience, to see the beauty of the forest, rather than the horror of what had befallen Marty's father so many years earlier. However, as the dirt trail led us deeper into the forest, that painful feeling started to return, the sense of imbalance deep within me. The trees likely lining the path at as a great distance as ever, seeming to squeeze us, narrowing the path to a fine point. As early evening approached, the sun disappeared behind an overcast sky, and the swaying ocean of bark suddenly seemed to whistle in the wind. Strange, indistinguishable shadows were cast by the moonlight, and they moved erratically as the forest elements wrestled with the storm. Without the sun to guide us, we lit the way with our phone torches, but there's always something a little disconcerting about artificial light in nature, as if it doesn't belong there. I find the glow of lamps and screens comforting in a home, for instance, but not in the depths of a forest. In contrast, I've always found nature quite beautiful during the day. The sunshine is flattering. The harsh beam of a torch in the black of the woods, however, has never managed to still my nervous thoughts. Then again, this all could be explained as always by Marty Baker. Poor Marty Baker, who never did anything wrong in his life, yet left me, even as an adult, with that same dark pit in my stomach, that same urge to run. And it was the most violently strong urge of my life as we walked through Gisburn Forest, an urge that I should have taken seriously. Under the blanket of night, even the sounds of the storm had changed. During the day, the wailing, the bellowing of the weather had near deafened me. In the dark of Gisburn Forest, seemingly endless woodland, however, there persisted only that haunting, high-pitched shriek, the nightmarish noise of gusts making their way through these slim cracks in the forest canopy, the openings between leaves that didn't quite touch. And I realized in this moment that the loudness of the day had been far more comforting than the quietness of the night, in much the same way that a crowded street can sometimes feel safer than an empty one. To put you in my shoes, I became more aware of my surroundings once the weather had quieted. In the silence and the black there seemed to lurk something. I had initially dismissed that prospect, scratching at the back of my thoughts because, quite frankly, I have a tendency to let anxiety get the better of me, to let it overpower my logical mind. I think you've most likely found that quite apparent by now, haven't you? In this case, however, I should have trusted my unsettled gut. I need to stop thinking that, I know. I'm tearing my mind apart with hypotheticals. What if we had turned around? What if Marty hadn't sought closure? Mr. Baker probably wouldn't have wanted his son to gain closure by visiting the reservoir in which he died. And he certainly wouldn't have wanted what came next. Not much farther now, Marty promised, shuffling confidently ahead. His boots were fighting tirelessly against the mud, though the same wasn't true of Angela, Gracie, and me. We were utterly exhausted. Not much further, he says. It's like deja vu. Remember when he said that we were nearly there half an hour ago? Angela asked Gracie, and the pair laughed. Hey, I heard that. Look, be grateful that I didn't take you on the 3-hour hike that I had originally had in mind, he said. You're saying that as if you've done it just for us, I said before snorting. Mate, I think the storm would have swept us off the ground. Not that blowing away would have been a bad thing. Might have given us a shortcut to the campsite. You're all so lazy, Marty groaned, before sarcastically adding, We're 10 minutes away tops. Just hold it together for a little longer, children, okay? You're all being so brave. Food and warmth await us. And in fairness to the man, he wasn't lying. As I've said, he's never been bad in the decision-making department. Misfortune simply comes for him at a rate that is far too high to be coincidental. Around 6 in the evening, after an hour of walking, we reached a small circular clearing in Gisburn Forest. The 4 of us triumphantly collapsed, confirming that Marty had been concealing his true exhaustion, and then Gracie began to put up the tents. Yeah, now who's lazy? She teased Marty as she got to work. Oh, are you planning an early night, kiddo? I was focusing more on the food first, he said, chortling as he started taking the portable stove, the bread rolls and sausages out of his rucksack. But before getting started with cooking, Marty proceeded to create a fire. Yes, I half cried, slobbering like some sort of ravenous hound. I even, in an equally dog-like manner, bounded over to my friend greedily and pestered him as he started preparing the meal. Oh, Marty, you beautiful, beautiful man. I totally agree with you, you know. You've got your priorities right. "Oh, he responded, smirking as he started to set up the stove. "You've changed your tune, Andy. You seem quite grumpy on the walk." "You know what, Marty? Yeah, that's fair. That's absolutely fair. And do you know, as I look at those beautiful Cumberland sausages, my dearest friend of all, I realize that I am in fact, just hangry," I said. My belly was working my mouth, you know what I mean. I wasn't thinking clearly. Gosh, you know what I mean to say is that I'm sorry. And then I lunged at Marty and squeezed him tightly. He laughed and pulled away. "Get off of me. You'll get your sausages without buttering me up, okay? Don't worry." "The onions look a little bit off," Angela said, eyeing the rest of the food in Marty's rucksack. Nothing a bit of fire from the stove won't solve. Burn the decay away." I laughed, but Angela sighed. "Boys." I'll come back to setting these up in a second. I'm just gonna go and look at the shrubbery," Gracie announced awkwardly as she stepped away from the first half-put-up tent. "Number 1 or number 2, Marty asked. "Oh, shut up," she muttered, grabbing her torch and disappearing into the trees. Once Gracie was out of sight and earshot, Angela and Marty exchanged a pair of mischievous grins, and then my oldest friend giggled under his breath while he rolled the sausages around on the burning stove. I sighed and then asked, "I'm going to regret asking this, but what inside joke has tickled you two hyenas?" "Oh, nothing," Marty snorted. I rolled my eyes. "Right, well, never mind then. I'm glad we sorted that out. I'll just go back to drooling over the sausages and you two, while you just enjoy laughing at nothing like a couple of lunatics." "Listen, Romeo, Marty and I have been talking," Angela said. "We've been plotting, as a matter of fact." "Oh, yeah, that's a better word. I like that," Marty agreed. "Oh, God," I started. "Angela and I want to share a tent," Marty declared. I raised an eyebrow and it was my turn to laugh. "Oh, you do? Really? Wow, that's just wow. Congrats, guys. I mean, I'm shocked, you know. I thought that you were only a fan of the fairer sex, Angela, but... Oh, bug off, Andrew." She interjected before I could really get rolling. "That isn't why we're sharing a tent. I promise you that Marty and I won't be hooking up. So don't try and be coy. We know what's going on with you, and you know why we're doing this." I smiled. "Listen, there's no need to be defensive. You'll find no judgment from me, Angela. Well, a little judgment because you chose Marty of all people, but... You, Gracie, 1 tent. Thoughts?" Marty asked bluntly, interrupting my mocking retort. My cheeks took the opportunity to redden once again. "I beg your pardon?" "Oh, come on," Angela continued. "I know, Marty knows, everybody who's met you two knows. There's no need to keep lying to us or yourself for that matter. You and Gracie clearly like each other. Just do us all a favor and get together. And then Marty and I can finally start making jokes about being the 3rd and 4th wheels." "Yeah, wait a minute, who's the 3rd?" Marty asked. "I think it should be me." "No," Angela said. "I'm the 3rd. I masterminded this plan, so I get priority. Stay in your lane, 4th wheel." "You're both scary sometimes," I said. "Forcing Gracie and me to share a tent is insane. Have you even asked her what she thinks about your plan?" "Well, we thought we would start with you, the one most likely to make a scene," Marty said before snorting with laughter once more. And I once more rolled my eyes. "You two are children. Look, even if hypothetically it were an idea that might in some way appeal to me." "Oh, it absolutely appeals to you," Angela interrupted. "Listen to yourself, stumbling over your words, turning red. Why are you fighting this, Andrew? We're teasing, but we're also trying to help you. We love you and Gracie." "And look at him, he's practically drooling," Marty added. I sighed. "Gracie wants to share a tent with you, Angela. I assure you that she doesn't want to share one with a boy." No, not a boy. The boy, Angela clarified, setting Marty off with laughter again. She wants to share one with you, Andrew. Everybody sees it other than you two. It's driving me insane, quite frankly. You need to both suck it up and say how you feel, Marty added. My face had turned a deep shade of crimson by this point, but I was interrupted moments before managing to retort. I'm sure it wouldn't have been the wittiest comeback, as I was far too flustered to think clearly. So flustered, in fact, that this sudden interruption in the form of crunching shrubbery only deepened the warm sensation in my blushing face. Angela and Marty wore similar expressions of fright as our 3 sets of eyes shot to the source of the commotion at the edge of the tree line. The dying motion of a swaying bush assured us that we hadn't imagined the sound. Something had rustled it. Oh, I laughed uncomfortably. That made me jump. Probably just a rabbit, Marty uncertainly suggested. And I was starting to nod in agreement, equally uncertain agreement, when I saw it. I didn't have to ask whether my 2 friends had seen it too, and they both gasped. A few feet past the edge of our clearing behind the trees was a shadow, taller than a rabbit or any woodland creature, which skulked slowly and menacingly through the darkness. A shadow with the outline of a man to anyone with eyes, creeping just beyond the bush and the reach of our campfire's glow. But we would all try for the remainder of the night to deny that it had in fact been a man. And in a way we were right. It was no man. Angela began to whisper, "Who the?" She trailed off as the shadow continued slinking away at a glacial pace. There was something unnerving about its snail-like pace, about the stranger's calmness in the wake of being caught. The watcher did not care that he had been detected. "Oh, very funny," Marty eventually called into the blackness. "I know that's you, Gracie. You scared us, congrats. So how about you come out of hiding now and..." "What's with all the ruckus?" came a familiar voice along with crunching boots from behind the 3 of us. Angela, Marty, and I snapped our necks 180 degrees and found ourselves eyeing Gracie. She had returned to the campsite and she was brushing past her half-erected tent. My stomach sank. I didn't want to do it. Didn't want to turn to look at the bush, but I did. And it was gone. The shape was gone. "How on earth did you do that?" Angela asked before smirking and shaking her head playfully. "Fair play, you got us." What do you mean?" Gracie replied, taking a seat on a camping chair beside me. "I'm so confused. I feel like I've come midway through some sort of inside joke. You mind connecting the dots on what I missed?" "Bravo," Marty snorted, flipping the sausages on the stove once more. "Like Angela said, you well and truly made us fill our pants, Gracie, and we deserve it for teasing you and Andy earlier, so fair enough." "What? I'm so lost," Gracie said, wearing a bewildered expression. Sensing that she wasn't feigning ignorance, I gulped and I leaned in towards her, and then I whispered, "That really wasn't you, by the bush." Gracie raised an eyebrow, and so I nodded at the other side of the clearing, towards the spot at which we had seen the shape, watching us from the darkness. Her eyes widened and she shook her head viciously. Her face started to pale, much like mine. "All right, these look ready to go," Marty announced, using tongs to serve up sausages and buns which he handed to each of us on paper plates. "I've got to hand it to you, Marty." Angela started taking a plate. "You're actually well prepared for once. This might be the first time you actually nailed a trap." "Wait, you're actually willing to overlook the weather then?" He gasped hopefully, seemingly desperate for a glowing review. She smiled, tightening her coat against the wind. It had slowed a little, but the storm was still very much raging. I eyed the 2 of them, Angela and Marty, with a frown, sensing that they were willfully choosing ignorance. They knew as well as I did that Gracie did not possess the superhuman speed necessary to have skirted around the campsite in the space of a second, to have somehow created the rustling sound in the bush and then appeared out of thin air behind us. "Guys," I said as my friend handed over the sausage sandwich, a packet of crisps, and a salt shaker. Truly, as Angela had pointed out, a boy dinner. Are we just going to ignore what happened? Who was that? Marty rolled his eyes, casting his eyes between Gracie and me. "Oh, I see, you're collaborating with her now. Look, the prank's over, you got us. Just let it drop, okay? You win, Gracie. And how many times should I say it? You win, you win, you..." "You and I both know that it wasn't Gracie," I interrupted before turning to Angela, who was nervously avoiding my gaze. "Come on, Angie. You know that there was somebody else out there. We have to go." "Go?" Marty scoffed, motioning around us. "It's pitch black and the storm hasn't fully passed yet. It was barely safe enough to make this walk during the day, and it definitely isn't safe enough to make it at night. So you want to walk back to the car at this time because we heard and saw an animal." "Oh, an animal. So you changed your story. It wasn't Gracie," I asked. "Look, Marty, I know this trip is important to you, but..." "Don't," he sharply warned in a tone cold and foreign. I sighed. "Hey, sorry, look, we need to be sensible here, right? Am I losing my mind? Please, somebody agree with me. If some nut job is watching us, we need to go. I would rather take my chances with the storm in the dark. We have torches and the wind has definitely calmed down a little." "I don't like this," Gracie whimpered. "You guys aren't playing a cruel joke on me, are you?" "We wouldn't do that," I promised. "We definitely saw somebody watching us." "It wasn't someone, it was something. Probably just a fox," Angela murmured between mouthfuls of her sandwich, but she had turned just as pale as Gracie and me. Even Marty was starting to look a little discomforted, as a matter of fact, and I was starting to feel that it came down to more than just the obvious fright of a woodland stranger spying on us. Something in that clearing wasn't quite right. Something in the whole of Gisburn Forest wasn't quite right. The more that I thought about it, the more I realized that even during the day, I had felt more unsettled than usual. I know that I've said that already, but I had been ignoring my gut until we saw the shadow in the trees. As I started to reflect, however, I realized that as dusk approached, I had sensed that something heavier than the violent tempest was weighing down upon us. And given that I clearly hadn't hallucinated that shape in the shadows, that feeling was starting to worsen. It wasn't all in my head, I thought. Maybe it's never been in my head. I didn't understand any of it yet. Didn't understand how it could possibly have anything to do with Marty, but I was starting to believe. As I looked at him, I was starting to consider that I had never been crazy at all. Of course, such a notion sounded insane, and so I pushed it aside. At the time, I rationalized that horrid feeling in my body as the result of adrenaline, my fight-or-flight response. I decided that I may have even seen the stalker earlier that day, and that this may have raised the hairs on my neck. But now, after everything that happened, I know better. "It wasn't a fox," I eventually said, after we had spent a few minutes sitting in silence, save for the sound of munching on our meager meal. "It was too tall to be a fox, Angela. It looked like a person." "Well, that's just the way the shadow," Marty began before trailing off and changing direction. "Look, it was a trick of the light from our fire, okay? From the stove. The smoke rising off from it." "I understand why you want to pretend otherwise, Marty," I said. I'm frightened too, okay? We all are. I think that much is obvious, and just by looking at our faces. And maybe this stranger is gone now. Maybe we have nothing to fear. But I don't know whether I really want to take that chance. Do you? I certainly don't think that we should sleep here." Well, maybe we've just, I don't know, pitched our tents a little too close to a farmer's land, Marty suggested. He might have been plucking up the courage to say something to us, but we scared him off, being use and all. Use? We're 24, I pointed out. I said I didn't want to go wild camping, Gracie said. I don't want to get into trouble. I don't want some maniac to come back out here with a shotgun. All right, let's all calm down, Marty softly said, licking his fingers. The colors seemed to have returned to his face, as if his new explanation had put his own mind at ease. Yeah, it was definitely a farmer, I'm certain of it. But we're not in any kind of trouble, Gracie. He would have said something, wouldn't he? He'll probably just kick us out in the morning, I reckon, when it's not dark, when the wind isn't threatening to knock him onto his butt. Or maybe it was just a man out for a late-night stroll, Angela offered. Marty raised an eyebrow. No, Angie, that makes less sense. In this weather, in the dark. Trust me, it was a farmer. But I didn't trust him. I didn't believe it. My gut didn't believe that we had simply been watched by a grouchy farmer with a vendetta against the supposed use, camping too near to his land. And when I researched the area on my phone, I found that we certainly didn't seem to be very close to any neighboring farms. We also didn't seem to be close to any of the official campsites for Gisburn Forest. However, I did tell myself that maybe, just maybe, Marty had been close to the truth, that the man had been no threat, that he had just been passing by, just a man if not a farmer and then a local. Maybe we had merely annoyed a concerned local, and maybe, just maybe, that concerned local had been mustering the courage to tell us off, but then he had lost the stomach for it. In any case, I realized around 10 in the evening that we weren't going anywhere. We were going to be staying put, and if I wanted to make it through the night without becoming a nervous wreck, I needed some assistance, needed something to help myself believe Marty's hypothesis more firmly. Vodka was the trusty tool which helped to settle my friend's idea more firmly into my mind. Well, vodka, cider, and a concoction of other various beverages which battered my senses and inhibited my better judgment. All by design, of course. This was hardly the first time that I'd gotten a bad feeling around Marty. The only good thing to come out of that night, to come out of our excessive drinking to be more exact, was that Gracie and I did end up sharing a tent. A liquid courage seemed to rid us of embarrassment, and we both giddily agreed to the sleeping arrangement. Angela and Marty relished in their wicked plan coming to fruition. As Gracie and I drunkenly staggered into the tent, I had expected, well, as far as I remember, I expected this, but I don't remember much, that we would simply clamber into our sleeping bags and pass out. But it seemed that our bravery knew no bounds, and we finally did what we had spent, or I had spent, at the very least, years hesitating to do. We kissed. There are further details, but my memory is foggy, mostly foggy. This would have been around 2 in the morning, I reckon. And it was around 5 in the morning, a little before sunrise and hours before the last of the alcohol left my system, that I was woken from my sleep. I drowsily tore my eyelids apart, stunned for a moment to find myself spooning Gracie in her sleeping bag. But that initial euphoria gave way to dread when I became painfully aware of the sound which had stirred me from my slumber. Shuffling footsteps. And again, I'm sure that I would have found if I had been looking into a mirror that my flesh had turned a pale shade of white once more. I certainly recognized that feeling in my core, a twisting churn, a knot that booze had temporarily untangled. However, I was sobering up, and instead of a pounding headache, I found myself only with a pounding chest as my eyes focused on the inner fabric of the tent. A figure's tall and bulky shadow danced against the wall, cast by the smoldering embers of the fire that we had foolishly, in our inebriated states, forgotten to extinguish. Someone was outside. Too large to be Angela, too tall to be Marty, but this danger paled in comparison to what followed. There came the sound of soil and mud being kicked up, and then the light from beyond our tent had vanished. The figure had extinguished what remained of our fire, reducing the outer world to blackness. The shadow vanished, and so I had only sounds to tell me what happened. The sounds of crunching footsteps, the sound of a zip, the sound of something muffled and pained. Hazy noises which I struggle to recall. Noises which disappeared either into the dark of the forest or the dark of my mind. Either way, my hungover body slipped back into the realm of sleep. And when I opened my eyes again 2 or 3 hours later, it was a much more forceful awakening. No room for hazy thoughts, given the commotion. Angela and Gracie were standing out in the forest clearing, anxiously half yelling at one another. "Just calm down, it's going to be okay," I heard Gracie promise. My head was pounding from the copious mixture of various drinks that I had practically inhaled the evening before. There did persist a distorted recollection of strange sights and sounds that had woken me at 5 o'clock, but my mind struggled to make sense of that memory. It was far from me at that moment. As I said, this was all by design. I had wanted to weaken my senses. I had wanted to, much like Marty and Angela, ignore the nightmare. The nightmare that none of us knew how to explain, but all of us sensed. I'm sure of that now. In any case, I wouldn't ordinarily drink so much. I rarely push my body to such extremes. I rarely get drunk at all, in fact. But I had fully intended to abuse my brain, so as to quiet the fearful thoughts, so as to quiet the itch, the full body itch, the urge, an urge to run far, far away from that campsite. But peer pressure had won. Alcohol had won, and only in the unforgiving, frosty glow of that early morning did I start to remember, start to feel dread working its way back into my stomach. I didn't need to hear the beginning of the conversation to know exactly why Angela and Gracie were so afraid. Marty was gone. He probably just had too much to drink and he wandered off somewhere. And Gracie half-heartedly suggested, "Oh, that's almost certainly what happened. But it doesn't exactly make the situation better, does it?" Angela said as I sat up and stared out of the open tent door. "In fact, it makes things worse. Is he safe? Did he trip and hurt himself? He got up in the middle of the night to go to the toilet. That's probably when he vanished. Why is he not back? I've been awake for an hour waiting patiently, but he's still out there. Well, maybe his toilet trip is just taking a while," my other friend feebly pointed out. "Gracie," Angela icily started, "he's gone, and I'm afraid that he's fallen in a ditch. That he's, I don't know, passed out and choked in his own vomit." "Jesus," Gracie cried. "I'm sure you're right that he's gotten himself a little muddled in his hungover state. Heck, his intoxicated state. I mean, we're all still a little drunk. But let's not start imagining all manner of catastrophes, okay? I think he's lost. I think he has wandered too far giggling to himself, probably still clutching a bottle of San Miguel, without a care in the world. And then at some point he realized that he didn't remember how to get back to the campsite. He left his phone," Angela murmured, looking back at her tent. "Right, there you go," Gracie replied. "So he's lost and he hasn't been able to contact us. Let's just keep cool heads, okay? Everything's going to be..." I lied. "We did see something last night and it wasn't a fox," Angela whispered, interrupting Gracie. "In the trees, I think, I don't know. Andrew was right. Marty and I were just trying to distract ourselves." Gracie shivered but tried to keep her head. "We don't need to start connecting the two things, okay? Anyway, speaking of Andrew, he should be helping us search for Marty. I'll go and wake him up." "No need," I announced, slipping out of the tent in a pair of joggers and a thick jumper. "I'm awake." "Did you hear all that?" asked Gracie. I shrugged. "I heard enough." "Marty's probably fine though, right?" Angela asked me hopefully, with fingernails sitting between her chattering teeth. I frowned. Like you said, we saw something in the trees last night. I wanted to go, but you guys convinced me that it would be too dangerous to leave. Convinced me that I had lost my mind. I believed you, Gracie protested. I met her and Marty, I said. They wanted to bury their own heads in the sand, and now our friend is missing. Let's just calm down, Gracie said. We don't know for sure that anything bad has happened to Marty. He's only lost. I'm certain of that. Angela huffed. You're a grown man, Andrew. I didn't make you stay, and I didn't claim that you had lost your mind at all. I just hoped that you were overreacting, okay? I really wanted to believe that it was only an animal. You both need to calm down, Gracie said, before turning to me and taking my hands in hers. I do still believe you, Andy, but for all we know, this has been blown way out of proportion. You remember what we agreed, that it might have just been a farmer. In fact, for all we know, Marty wandered off to find the guy, talk to him, make sure that we're allowed to camp here again tonight, right? There are too many hypotheticals in this scenario, I said, shaking my head. I don't like it, Gracie, any of it. I've got a weird feeling in my stomach. I've had it since we came here. It feels like something's eating away at my insides, Angela whispered absent-mindedly, her eyes boring into a nearby tree. I snapped my fingers and then looked at Gracie. See? She feels the exact same way as me. That isn't normal, and I bet that you feel it too, right? It's anxiety, Andrew, Gracie replied, though her voice did sound a little uncertain. You're describing anxiety. Our friend is missing, so we're all understandably a little anxious. It's the early morning, it's freezing, and we're all starving, hungry, thirsty. Our bodies are screaming at us. I felt anxious before, Gracie, I said, shaking my head again, shaking it so feverishly that I thought it might topple off from my neck. Something hasn't been right since we walked into this forest. It's not nerves that I feel in my gut. It's emptiness, Angela coldly finished. Like a hand reached inside and cleared room inside our bellies for something else. My eyes widened. Angela had done it. She had perfectly described the feeling that had been plaguing me for the past half a day. The feeling that I had temporarily drowned with Smirnoff and San Miguel, only for the sobering light of day to illuminate the truth once more. Something in this forest was very wrong. Worse than that, something very wrong had happened to Marty, and I was absolutely certain of it. Jesus, Gracie groaned, despairing at the two of us. We all just feel this way because, well, we're just thinking about what happened to Mr. Baker. It's weird for Marty to want to come here, isn't it? In fact, maybe he's even gone down to the reservoir. That's where we should start. I had to admit in that moment, I had a strange feeling that Gracie might be right. But the reservoir was a fair walk from our camping spot. That was the only real reason the three of us had agreed to Marty's request. In all honesty, not that we would have ever told him that. Gracie hurriedly packed some food and water bottles into a bag, slung it over her shoulders, and let out a heavy sigh. So where do we start? I mean, I think that we should head west towards the reservoir, but we need to look for him along the way. Do we split up to cover more ground? I shook my head. If Marty got lost during daylight, then it might well happen to any of us. We need to stay together, the three of us. Really? It'll take longer if we find him that way, Gracie said. I'm good at keeping my bearings, plus I feel sober enough to find my way back to camp, so... We stick together, I firmly reiterated. And that's final. Angela nodded, her eyes still vacant. She seemed to have near entirely disassociated from reality. Yeah, Andrew's right. We stick together. She trailed off before finishing her sentence, perhaps before even finishing her thought. And this only assured me, seemed to assure Gracie too, judging by the wince which had passed across her face, that we shouldn't leave Angela on her own. And Gracie and I may well have been safe to explore the forest individually, and I have no doubt that we both would have been able to navigate back to the campsite, but there was something wrong with Angela's eyes, with her face. She wasn't herself, and I didn't fancy searching for two missing friends. Armed with Gracie's bag of essentials and a brisk breeze pushing us along, we departed from the supposed safety of our forest clearing and let the day's early light guide us through the dense ocean of bark which formed Gisburn Forest. No, it formed a fraction of Gisburn Forest, and I was certain that no matter whose prediction about Marty's fate turned out to be true, we would have a rotten time finding him in such a vast area of land. Their predictions were wrong, and for that matter, my prediction was wrong. "The tracks are all wrong," I muttered, looking down at the trail of muddy boot prints that we were following, looking hopelessly at the many other trails of boot prints shooting off from the main one that we were following. "Just look. It seems that Marty or somebody else walked in numerous directions." "Well, that makes sense. He's drunk, he's staggering," Gracie uncertainly responded. I knew that I was forgetting something from the early morning, but I didn't quite recall the sounds. The campfire being extinguished, not until much later. But Angela pointed out, "No, Andrew's right. There are footprints disappearing in all directions. Who's to say that we're following the right trail?" "Well, we have to start somewhere," Gracie exasperatedly said, clearly tiring from having to be the one sane member of the trio, while the one serene and level-headed member of the trio at any rate. And then Angela turned and worriedly whispered to me, "Have you noticed that some of the boot prints are different sizes?" I nodded. That was the first thing that I had noticed. I don't know how far we trudged before something broke up the maddening cluster of trees. I think that we had been walking for a little over an hour, maybe two. Whatever the case, I was a little thankful when we had exited from the forest into a large and spacious hilly field. It certainly made me feel, at the very least, as if we had escaped from some dizzying Blair Witch-esque spatial loop in the woodland. That euphoric feeling, however, did nothing to loosen the tightness in my gut, or as Angela aptly put it, the emptiness. The void ready to be filled with something. "See?" Gracie said, waving her arms at the well-trimmed and well-grazed field. "This clearly belongs to a farmer, doesn't it?" "Sure," I said, "but I still doubt that he would wander 2 hours away from his field in the middle of the night, though. That's not who we saw." She sighed. "Come on, chums, let's keep our heads up. We're gonna find Marty, we just need to assume the best. We don't know anything yet, so we shouldn't assume anything at all," I said. "Like, assuming that he's totally fine because he might not be, Gracie. I think we need to start accepting that if we want to truly keep our heads." "Yeah, fine, we shouldn't assume anything," Gracie replied, "other than the completely rational idea that this mysterious feeling in our or in your stomachs means something. I'm not saying that it means something. I hope it's anxiety too, Gracie," I said softly, offering her a smile, and she offered one back. "We'll find him," she promised. "Lots of boot prints leading through this field, aren't there?" "There are," I agreed, nodding my head. And then my eyes widened and my finger pointed outwards. "And there's that." We had been crossing over top of the mountain which the field sat, and the roof of a wooden barn had been slowly coming into view, just over the brow of the grassy hill. Of course, I wasn't blown away to see that. It was in no small way to be expected. Farmers have fields and farmers have barns. They do usually have cattle, though none could be found in this particular field. Still, even if this meant little, as I assumed the livestock would be indoors. Wrong again. As the foot of the barn finally came into view, So did a horrific sight, one that left Gracie dry heaving, Angela whimpering deliriously, and me releasing a series of expletives. Blood. An abundance of blood staining the grass and the barn. The watery remnants of what must have been a 4 feet deep tide of red that had swept through the lower portion of the field, given how high the red stains rose on the wooden walls and doors of the barn. The blood-soaked grass left behind was, to my eyes, the riverbed of Hades itself. It surrounded the barn like a nightmarish moat, and lying in that drying riverbed were cows, the many lifeless and gutted carcasses of cows, some displaying rib cages and others displaying skulls. Gracie began to cry. "What in the ever-living? Marty's not okay, is he?" Angela wailed. "We knew that. Oh God, we should have just gone back to the car. We should have driven far from here. We have to be near the main road now, right? Maybe we could just hail down a ride. Maybe we should. We have to find him," Gracie yelled. "If something's happened to him, well, if we leave without him, I won't be able to live with myself. Will you? I'll feel that guilt forever. The guilt of leaving him in some situation." "By some situation, you mean the work of the devil?" I asked, as we looked upon from our perching point on the hill, the horror below. I felt at least a little safer from the summit. "Please, Andy," Gracie begged, nodding at Angela. "She's already falling apart, so I need you to just, I don't know, try to keep it together. I know that it's hard." "How was there so much blood?" I whispered. There are about 6 dead cows, I would say. There's too much blood on the sides of the barn." "Andrew, I have no idea how much blood would come from 6. Gracie began before pausing to retch a little. She swallowed whatever tried to come up. "Hey, we're gonna be fine, okay? We're going to be absolutely fine. It wasn't the devil, it was something," I said as we stayed completely still atop the summit, feet digging into the grass and refusing to budge. "Don't try to dismiss this one, Gracie. It wasn't an act of nature." "Well, it wasn't an act of Satan either," she hoarsely insisted before gulping. "It was someone, okay? Someone's out here, Andrew. Fine, I accept it. But it wasn't anything beyond explanation. You know that, I know that, Angela knows that, and Marty may well know that too. Maybe he saw this horrible scene and ran, I don't know. But what I do know is that I don't want to leave until I know that he's okay." "I'm going," Angela croaked, phone in hand, GPS at the ready, as she began to shuffle down the hill, quickly building up her pace, as if worried that we would try to stop her. "There's a road only a quarter mile away, by the reservoir. I'm giving the barn a wide berth, but I'll call for help on the way, okay?" "Angela, slow down," Gracie pleaded. "I love Marty, but he's gone. Gracie, he's gone." Angela half screamed as she barreled down the hill, not even turning to face us, the 2 friends that she had abandoned. "I'll call you when I find someone." Gracie looked at me tearfully and I shook my head before saying, "I'm not going to leave Marty and I'm not going to leave you either." "But for Angela," she gulped. I took Gracie's hand. "Don't worry about her. She'll make it to the road and call for help, and then somebody will come for us, all 4 of us. We're all going home." "Should one of us call someone too?" Gracie asked as we slowly walked down the hill towards the barn, but I shook my head and I nodded at Angela, who was running diagonally through the field, bearing right to, as she put it, give the barn a wide berth, and her hand was up to her ear. "Look, she's already on the phone with the police," I said as we tentatively crept down the hilly slope. "And I don't know about you, Gracie, but I don't much feel like calling them, you know." She nodded and then huskily added, "Yeah, I think that I'll leave Angela to it. My voice might break if I try to describe what we saw, what we're seeing." I nodded and the 2 of us continued towards the barn as Angela disappeared out of sight, slipping into some trees which lined the farmer's property. We marched unwillingly towards the blood-stained barn and my eyes watered at the sight of the butchered livestock. I really thought that prolonged exposure would desensitize me to the terror of the situation, but it only seemed to worsen the pain, only seemed to deepen the blade in my gut. I was perfectly content with staying quiet, perfectly content with simply focusing my will and my senses on pushing ahead, exploring the barn somehow in some impossible way, finding Marty unharmed. I thought that Gracie and I were on the same wavelength, that we had come to some unspoken agreement about silence being the best form of action, the best way of tolerating the wretchedness of what we were seeing, and the nearer that we came to the barn, what we were smelling. The putrid stench of decomposition, of ruinous, fruitless decay. After all, these cattle had clearly not been brought to the slaughter for the sake of meat production. They were killed as a statement, perhaps a show of force, but certainly not a warning for people to stay away, a promise I knew of something more direful to come. In any case, I was wrong about Gracie. She broke our unspoken agreement and made the terror far worse by uttering, "Marty's in there, isn't he?" "Gracie," I started as we came to the edge of the gutted cows, only 10 or 20 yards away from the barn doors, which were ever so slightly ajar. "He's in there," she said, squeezing my hand in a vice-like grip. "Maybe we should follow Angela." "Hey, you said it yourself," I replied, turning to Gracie and offering her my best attempt at a comforting smile. It will have been a snotty, teary-eyed grimace of pain and suffering, of course, but I tried. "I know," she said. I wouldn't be able to live with myself either," I finished. "Even if it weren't Marty, if it were some stranger plucked from the street, I would feel immense guilt for leaving them behind. But Marty is, well, it's Marty. He wouldn't leave any of us behind." And Gracie's eyes narrowed and she scrunched up her face as she nodded. "I'm so angry at Angela for her. She's scared," I interrupted, before my friend had the chance to say something that she would regret. "She's not herself, you saw that. I'm worried about her out there too, to be honest." "Yeah, so am I," Gracie choked. "I didn't want her to leave." "After we find Marty, we'll find her," I said. "She said that she would call us, didn't she? When she gets to the road. Or when she finds someone," Gracie said. I nodded. "Yeah, she'll call us. But we need to do this, Gracie. We need to." "I know," she interjected, pulling her eyes away from me to look at the blood-stained barn doors behind the carcasses. Doors that were creaking slightly in the early morning breeze. "I guess I just wanted a moment to collect myself, you know. I wanted to delay going inside. Marty might need us," I said as I started to guide Grace around the dead cattle, and grimacing slightly at the squelch of red mud beneath my feet. She said nothing in response, most likely because she had lost the strength to talk. Gracie was once again focusing all of her will on placing one foot in front of the other, on finding the strength to follow me towards those doors, which offered only a sliver of darkness through the opening. And as my spare hand reached towards the brass handle, those biting teeth in my gut chewed more ravenously, leaving my abdomen with a splitting agony that almost buckled my knees. But I managed to pull the right-hand barn door open, ignoring the shiver which the resulting creak sent down my spine. And then I brought out my phone and tapped the torch button. And Gracie and I both let out a collective sigh of relief as we found ourselves eyeing a relatively empty and entirely bloodless barn interior. Large walls lined with metal pens for the cattle rose 30 feet up to a triangular ceiling supported by thick wooden beams. Everything was pristine and unmarred by the horror in the field outside, though a small puddle of blood was threatening to spill through the open doors onto the barn's dirt floor. "He's not in here," Gracie said, her voice sounding simultaneously relieved and dejected. "No, he isn't," I said, squeezing her hand tightly. "But come on, let's look around. He might have been here. We might find some sign of him at the very least, something that'll help to show us where he went. It's impossible to know whether he was here, Gracie said as we tiptoed cautiously through the empty barn, boots squelching in the thick mud. I mean, I see boot prints, hundreds of them, but they most likely belong to the farmer who owns this barn in which we're trespassing. Hey, just keep your head, Gracie. That was what you said to me, wasn't it? I asked. She smiled weakly. At least it was the closest thing that either of us could have mustered in the form of a smile, given the circumstances. Yeah, sorry, you're right. You know, it seems only one of us stays sane at any given time now, doesn't it? Well, you've been doing some heavy lifting, so it's probably my turn now, isn't it? I replied. Gracie seemed to be on the verge of responding, but when she lifted her gaze towards mine, that smile, already frail and unstable, completely gave way to an open-mouthed screech. She had seen something over my shoulder. I spun and then stumbled backwards upon my eyes meeting what Gracie had seen. There was a man, middle-aged, gray-bearded, and sporting a ripped flannel shirt, sitting against the barn wall behind us. He was leaning against the metal edge of the pen, which was why we had initially failed to see him. And it was no surprise that we hadn't heard him, for he was only releasing a series of low and near inaudible grunts. Dying grunts. He had been like each of the cows outside, disemboweled, only partially, but I knew that he had minutes left at the very best. But the rest of his body remained. His skull did not show, though his face certainly seemed pale and skeletal. He clung to the last strands of life, which he used to speak to us. He came back for me, the fading farmer mumbled deliriously. I gulped, starting to dial 999. I'm going to call the... You both need to run, the man growled, moaning painfully as his hands against his abdomen failed to stop the blood from gushing over under him between his fingers. This isn't. It has nothing to do with you. Our friend has already called the police, Gracie added, as I held the phone shakily to my ear. They'll be here soon. It'll all be over by then, the farmer whispered, eyes twitching. Just like last time. Ambulance, please, I told the automated response at the other end of the line. The two of you, run. He's still here and he's not done. He won't be done until we pay for what we did. Hello? I told the operator, ignoring the tap on my shoulder and the sound of slapping mud beyond the barn. Yes, I'm at a farm in, near Gisburn Forest. Yes, the reservoir. Andrew, Gracie hissed, tapping on my shoulder less patiently. But I continued. Well, it's... And then came a scream which caused me to jolt in shock, dropping the phone in the mud and turning my head towards the noise. Help! Cried Angela as she came barreling through the doors at the other side of the barn. He's... Gracie and I eyed our friend as her wide mouth froze mid-sentence, stopped and eyed us with tears streaming down her cheeks. The translucent streams running down her cheeks were joined swiftly by red which spilled out of her lips, along with fingers. Fingers that retracted like blades, retracted out of Angela's non-existent nape. And our dear friend fell to the mud in a bloody and punctured heap. Grace screamed and I simply watched in paralyzed fear as more muddy slaps sounded as the bulky figure emerged in the daylight, filling the doorway. The reservoir stood at the foot of the farmer's land, stretching beyond our field of view, but I only recalled that later. At the time, I noticed only the man. He was no longer just a shadow. Lord forgive me, choked the dying farmer. Those were the last words that I heard him say. Though he may have said more, my ears were too busy ringing as I tried to process the 7-foot-tall man, body coated in clothes too thickly concealed with dirt and blood to properly distinguish. His head, the only truly visible part of his body through the filth, was not the head of a living man. His skin was peeling, revealing maggots and bones swimming behind his face's surface, or lack of surface, and it tilted sideways, barely supported by a neck that seemed withered and bruised. This man was dead, and he raised his bloody fingers, seeming to prepare to pounce at Gracie and me. There came not a malicious smile and not a sudden roar of triumph, but a sudden widening of his bloodshot eyes, as if he had seen something in the distance, something that we did not see. And then he turned on his heel and left, walked away, trudged through the mud, leaving Gracie and me shuddering as we eyed Angela's mangled corpse in the mud. When the police arrived a half-hour later, having received Angela's call, Gracie and I struggled to explain what we saw. Not simply because we were traumatized, terrified, questioning the very nature of reality. No, we were stunned because the paramedics reunited us with a very pale-skinned man who wore an emergency blanket around his shivering body, though it did not conceal his bruised neck. Marty Baker. Gracie and I embraced him, sobbing as we mourned our dead friend. The police still don't know what to make of the case, but Marty told me something last night, something that fills me with terror beyond comprehension. That was Arnold Fletcher, he whispered as we sat quietly in my living room, unwatched television playing in the background. What? I croaked. Marty shuddered, tenderly touching the brace supporting his broken and swollen neck. Arnold Fletcher. He went to my father's school. One night after school, they all came out here, camped on Farmer Grant's land, and Arnold got into a fight with Spencer Davies. Spencer started choking him, and every time that Arnold came up for air, he screamed for help, but everybody just watched in fear. My dad, his classmates, Farmer Grant, who came running down to see what was happening, they did nothing. Too scared to get involved, I suppose. Too cowardly. Arnold died that day in 1990. I shuddered, recalling the ghostly, undead thing that I had seen in the doorway of Farmer Grant's barn. It was all coming together, this tale of vengeance. Did your father tell you that story? I asked meekly. Marty shook his head, eyes blankly watching the television. No, Arnold Fletcher himself told me, Wally. And then my friend lifted his hands to his throat, stopped by the neck brace, but I recognized the choking gesture. I understood what he meant. Just as I finally understood Marty's life of failures orchestrated by some spectral hand, and a thing that vengeful, that far from human, forgets its true purpose. It becomes so distant from the original source of its fury, which raised it from the grave, that it starts killing mindlessly. Firstly, it kills those involved in that day, Mr. Baker, Farmer Grant, and then it punishes Marty Baker, the son of a culpable man. And finally, it kills Angela Whaley, a woman not from this area, a woman not involved in the slightest with Arnold Fletcher's demise in 1990, and we weren't even born then. The thing which haunts the land of Gisburn Forest is no longer a thing that seeks vengeance at all. It seeks blood, the blood of anything that stumbles into its path. Country Allen, Jerry Ramey, MP Massacre 91, Nelson Asada, Die Screaming, Meat Gasher, Justin Fodenauer, Malcolm Black, Dalla Magara, Caden Gibbler, That One Woodsman,